Hello again. In this video, I'm going to be going over the notion that the Israel lobby, neoconservatives, or just generally like Jews, pushed the US into the war with Iraq in 2003. The main text that people go to generally support the lobby neocon thesis is Walt and Mearsheimer's The Israel Lobby, which was an essay published in 2006 and then like a longer book format they released in 2007. And the book goes over multiple aspects of the lobby and its influence on the US, not just the Iraq war. But in this video, and it's going to be a two-part video, I'm only going to really be focusing on the Iraq war. I'll cover a little bit of some other generic like critiques of Walt and Mearsheimer. And not everything they say is wrong, obviously. And I would say a lot of the stuff they say about, in the Iraq war section at least, because that's the only section I really focused on, was pretty accurate. It's just like, depends on your interpretation of how those accurate statements actually affected policy and whatnot, but we'll get into that. But I do want to start off giving a little generic history of the US in the Middle East, just because I feel like people kind of forget that there were other things going on and that the Iraq war didn't just like occur out of a vacuum. Like obviously we had the first Gulf War against Saddam after he invaded Kuwait, but even before then, like obviously the US had a major presence in the Middle East, mainly because of like strategic oil reasons. So in terms of the US, during World War II in 1944, Roosevelt met with the Saudi king, Ibn Saud, and formed kind of like a secret partnership, more or less, promising US protection of Saudi Arabia in exchange for oil access. Obviously oil at this time, up until the present, is like an extremely important asset in a modern industrial economy. And from there, you could see the U.S. interfering or just using its leverage in the Middle East, from Operation Ajax in Iran, which got rid of the elected prime minister and installed the Shah, who was friendly to the West. Nixon's doctrine of arming both Iran and Saudi. This was more in a response to like Soviet Union encroachments, so they just wanted to back up any like Western allied nation with military arms. The Carter Doctrine, promulgated in 1980, in which he explicitly says, "Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force." And this was, brought upon by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the recent Islamic Revolution in Iran, and then the first Gulf War, as I mentioned, in which we had already deployed troops in Saudi Arabia prior to the war even starting, as part of an explicit desire to repel any would-be attack from Saddam against Saudi Arabia as part of our defensive pact with them. So basically just kind of like showing that the US was involved in the Middle East way before just 2003. I mean, this is obvious to anyone, but I just like to give like a historical background. You'll see in Walt and Mearsheimer's text, they kind of deny the importance of oil in the second Gulf War, but there's people who would argue against that. And just generally the background of the whole region of why the US has been interested in it has more or less been because of oil. It doesn't necessarily mean that every war that was fought or whatever was like explicitly directly for oil, but that's just kind of like the background reasoning why the region is so important anyway, and not necessarily just important because the US really likes Israel or Israel's like pushing the US to do certain things. And as I'll kind of show, like there was times when US goals align with Israel and other times not. And most people, when they look at the situation, they usually see the US as kind of like the, from a realist, I don't know if that's the right word, perspective, kind of tells a smaller nation of Israel like what to do more than Israel telling the bigger nation, the US, what to do, kind of like the tail wagging the dog kind of thing. And so that's just like a real quick overview of US involvement in the Middle East. But when it comes to Israel, the US wasn't really like a super strong ally of Israel or anything up until the 67 war, in which Israel kind of shot down Nasserism, which was allied to the Soviet Union, so that's when the US started taking more of an interest in Israel. And also there was this view that Israel wouldn't like last super long, but when it survived the 67 war, there was a view that it could have more longevity, and a lot of American Jews too were attracted to it. And then didn't mention the Arab oil embargo a couple years later, which was a response to US support for Israel. So that's like probably like the first time that like US support for Israel like had that kind of concrete negative reaction. So that's a good example of like US support for Israel having a negative outcome, just something that Walt and Mearsheimer argue that overall U.S. support for Israel is something that leads to negative outcomes for the U.S. And, because they're realists, they believe that the U.S. should only pursue things in its own interests. I mean, that's just kind of common sense. But I do think the Arab oil embargo is a good example of Israel not really helping out the U.S. And so moving on with more focus on Israel, we could also focus on the Israel lobby pre-Iraq war as well. They both kind of coincide because in the Walt and Mearsheimer book, as I said, they don't only talk about Iraq. Most of the book is talking about before Iraq anyway. They generally argue that Israel in the lobby has pressured the U.S. into certain policy moves and has just been more of a tail wagging the dog type of thing. But there are a decent amount of historical examples where this is not the case. This is not the main point of the video, but I'll just mention a couple that are mentioned in some critiques of the Walt and Mearsheimer book. One example is the sale of weapon systems to Saudi Arabia that the Israel lobby and Israel itself did not want the U.S. to go through with, but the U.S. sold an $8.5 billion weapon system to Saudi Arabia. And just in general, the Saudi-U.S. relationship is really tight, as I mentioned before. It was established before the U.S.-Israeli relationship. The ambassador from Saudi to the U.S., Bandar, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, was pretty close to the Bush family and was given early access plans to the Iraq war, but that's neither here nor there. During the first Gulf War, the U.S. explicitly told Israel to back off attacking Iraq, even though Saddam sent Scud missiles over to Israel and Israel wanted to retaliate. In the Israeli mind, this was not a good look because it showed that it was kind of a weakness, we can't respond or retaliate to a direct assault. U.S. involvement in Bosnia and Kosovo, while the Jewish neocons supported that intervention and pressed for it, Israel under Sharon publicly opposed that intervention. Again, just showing that there's a difference between Israel and the Israel lobby and specific Jewish neoconservatives in the U.S. Another case that really struck me, I didn't know about, was that Israel and North Korea, of all countries, were going to make an agreement in which Israel would trade and invest in North Korea in response to North Korea no longer sending missiles to Iran, which would obviously be a huge help to Israel because Israel has always considered Iran a greater threat than basically any other country, including Iraq, which is another topic. But this deal was shot down mainly by the U.S. So that's a pretty clear example of U.S. calling the shots when it comes to Israel, not Israel calling the shots when it comes to the U.S. Even during the Iran-Iraq war, the U.S. supported Saddam initially, but Israel actually supported Iran, and that's why Israel blew up a nuclear reactor in Iraq or during that war, which later on during the first Gulf War, the U.S. would come out and say thank you for doing that, whatever. I mean, there was statements saying that was a big help. But anyway, it's just another case showing that there was two different interests going on. I think at the time Israel just thought that maybe it could still gain support from Iran because before the Islamic Revolution, Iran was decently friendly to Israel. So maybe they thought they could save that relationship. And also during the 56 Suez Canal crisis, the U.S. was anti-British, French, Israeli control over the Suez Canal. So all those are just examples of U.S.-Israel interests kind of clashing and basically the U.S. kind of having the bigger role in calling the shots or just showing some friction. Because I think there's this view in the, dissident right or also sometimes the far left community that Israel's really pulling all the strings and stuff. But again, this is all not to do with the Iraq war yet, so I got to get there soon. But I will say also that there are just other general criticisms of the Walt Mearsheimer work. You have people even Benny Morris, who was a historian that Walt Mearsheimer used, who talked about general Israeli-Palestinian history, and Morris himself went on to say that the use of his quotes and his work was really shoddy. That's just coming from him. People like Chomsky saying kind of what I've been saying, that when the interests of Israel and U.S. coincide, that's fine, but when they don't, usually the U.S. is the one that calls the shots. And a big criticism is that, Israel is causing a lot of the terrorism that's occurring, bin Laden used it as one reason why he's, committing terrorism, and that support for Israel angers the quote-unquote Arab street, which is just the Arab general populace, which is true. It does put U.S. opinion of the U.S. in the Arab world in a more negative light when the U.S. supports Israel. But Chomsky's response to that is just that that's why the U.S. supports dictators and has always supported dictators, mainly because that's the easiest way to gain access to oil and stuff. Again, it's basically just all goes back to that. It's kind of cliche, but it's also kind of true. I mean, you could obviously see this with the U.S. support of the Saudis for so long and support for like general non-democracies as long as they align with the U.S. Another person who has done a lot of critiques of the Israel lobby work is Stephen Zunes, who's argued that a lot of the influence that the Israel lobby has is influential in Congress, but it doesn't really reflect like foreign policy as such when it comes to like invasions of other countries or war or anything like that. It's more to do with just like specific Israel policies when it comes to Palestine and Israel. And a lot of the congressmen who support Israel and are like backed by AIPAC are in safe congressional districts anyway, where they would get reelected regardless. He brings up a couple examples of congressmen who AIPAC kind of campaigned against and who did not get reelected, like Finley and Cynthia McKinney, but he suggests that there were other lobbies who were against them and other reasons why they didn't get reelected, so it can't just like all be put at the blame of this like, you know, super powerful lobby. Also, you can look at the book Transforming America's Israel Lobby by Dan Fleshler, and he comes up with some examples of congressmen and women not agreeing with the Israel lobby or whatever, and there's like really no concrete pushback, or if there is a pushback, it doesn't really do anything. And that counted among other lobbies, like the amount of money that they, you know, donate and stuff isn't really like super high, albeit he's talking about the early aughts. But again, that's the time period we're talking about anyway. So I don't really know about the modern, like 2022 Israel lobby influence. I would imagine it's even less than it used to be, but who knows? And that's not really the point of this video. And also, that's not even the main focus that I want to go into in terms of Walt and Mearsheimer's work. I just want to look at the Iraq portion of their work. So let's finally get to that. And I'll try to list all the sources I use. And everything I just said was just like in response to the general theme of their work. And this isn't to say that they don't have responses, that there's a back and forth between them and their critics. So, you know, whatever. I mean, you guys just have to do the research for that. When it comes to these like poli-sci things, it's not like an exact science. So there's always going to be debate and whatnot. So going off Walt and Mearsheimer's book, page 230, at least the PDF version. So Walt and Mearsheimer, they say that Israel supported these efforts because they wanted the U.S. to topple one of their main regional adversaries. This is partly true, but partly not. There was an emphasis on the part of Israel to suggest that Iran was more of a threat and that Iraq at the time was not very powerful. Various military officials, politicians in Israel kind of sounded this similar reasoning, that Iran was really the thing to go after, not Iraq, and that there were even some fears that if Iraq was toppled, that it would create a power vacuum for Iran to fill. And I mean, this is pretty clear that a lot of people will say like, oh, Israel is trying to push the U.S. into a war with Iran, which, I mean, that's not even that controversial. I mean, I'm sure Israel would love to see Iran, the leadership, get toppled. So I think everyone can understand that. And at the time, the situation was, I mean, not really any different. Iran was definitely more powerful than Iraq. And a lot of things that Saddam had done, like in 91 when he fired Scud missiles and stuff, he did not have the capacity to do anymore. And there was just a lot of things that he did that either he wasn't the only one doing them in the Arab world, or he just didn't have the former military capacity he used to. And it was generally agreed upon that Iran was a bigger threat. That's not to say that once the U.S. had its mind fixated on going to war, that Israel didn't support that and push that, but that was after the decision had been made. Also, they have this odd notion that the whole war for oil thing is fallacious, so that there's little direct evidence to support that claim. We can get into that later because they mention it again. This is just their introduction, but I find that pretty odd. I mean, there's just been a lot written about oil in Iraq. It doesn't have to be this like extremely direct, like, the oil lobby pushed Bush into war and because they wanted more access to oil. Like, that's not necessarily how it works. It's more a broad and generic thing, to put it in a strange way. I don't really know how to describe it, but they go on to say that in their view, the war was mainly fueled by a desire to make Israel more secure. They quote people like Philip Zelikow stating the real threat of Iraq is the threat against Israel. People like General Wesley Clark echoing the same sentiment. Senator Ernest Hollings, as well as citing just other public figures, including Pat Buchanan, who called it like a war for Israel and have that same sentiment that Israel was pushing the war. All those quotes are like real. I checked them and whatnot. I know Zelikow said that he was being misquoted out of context, but there was some back and forth on that. So I'm pretty sure he was quoted in context. But regardless, I think it is interesting that they go towards this view and then their previous view on oil not having any direct evidence or quotations. I mean, plenty of people have also written about that. There was a huge view at the time as well that oil was a big part of the war. So I just don't know why they use this methodology to support the war for Israel thing, but not the war for oil thing. He goes further to say that some Israeli leaders told officials that they thought Iran was a greater threat, but they essentially didn't try to convince the Bush administration not to go to war against Iraq. I wouldn't necessarily call not trying to convince someone not to do something the same as pushing them towards something. I think they were ambivalent towards it. I think they probably would have wanted another course of action, just like a direct attack on Iran, to be honest. But I wouldn't call this like a direct push to go to war. And they also say, in short, Israel did not initiate the campaign for war against Iraq, which I agree with. And then he says it was the neoconservatives in the United States who conceived the idea. I'm going to go over the neocons more in part 2 of this video, but I half agree with that in the sense that the neocons had always wanted to take Saddam out, but I don't think they were the ones who like called the shots at the end of the day. Not to say they weren't influential or a factor, but and we can get into that in part 2. And I actually think the neocon element is way more interesting and way more concrete and solid than the just lobby in Israel portion, to be honest. They go on to talk about how Israeli leaders and Sharon tried to push the U.S. to quickly act once the decision to go to war was made. Again, all those articles they list are like accurate. I mean, they're not like just making stuff up. And that there was a fear from the Israelis that if the U.S. failed or did a bad job or whatnot, it would just, obviously be bad for them. And you can see this with Sharon. He actually privately told Bush his concerns against occupying Iraq. I don't know if this means that he like privately told Bush not to invade at all, or if he just said, oh, you should not like try to occupy Iraq. But there was certainly a concern that the longer they waited, the more time like Saddam would have to like, I guess, beef up defense or just like hide supposed weapons or whatnot. I mean, obviously the whole issue of WMDs is a different thing, but really I have no qualm against them saying that Israel wanted this done quickly so that the U.S. could supposedly move on to other countries. However, I think they go too far in highlighting the importance of like these figures and these like people like Netanyahu writing about how he thinks the U.S. should go to war. I don't think like op-eds and articles and even foreign leaders really matter that much. It's kind of like looking at a lot of like op-ed writers and just people here in the States arguing for war in Iraq and saying that they were like the main cause, like Ann Coulter, Chris Hitchens, Michael Ignatieff, Bill Keller, Fareed Zakaria, Michael Kelly, all these people who weren't Jews, weren't necessarily like huge supporters of Israel. I wouldn't say that they like were the main reason that we went to Iraq. Not to mention a lot of Jewish people were against the war in Iraq, disproportionately so, which Walt and Mearsheimer also talk about. And there's pretty famous, or not famous, but just well-known columnists at the time who were Jewish who also were against the Iraq war, like David Reef, Michael Walzer, Todd Gitlin, etc. But of course, their efforts were to no avail either. Later, they go on to talk about how Israel was the only country outside of the U.S. where a majority of the public favored the war, according to polling. That's also true, but keyword is outside of the United States, meaning that people in the U.S. were also favorable of the war, and I just think that is a more significant figure. And anyway, the argument isn't really, did Israel want the war to happen, is did Israel effectively push the war to happen? So that's really the question, and I don't think they make a solid connection. I think overall it's a good like source just to have like, oh, there's these articles, this data, but I don't think it makes an effective case that there was like an effective link between these things and the actual decision to go to war. And I take that view across like the board with their whole section, but we can keep moving on. So they talk about the lobby and then how they interpret it. The lobby isn't just AIPAC, but I mean, for all intents and purposes, in my mind, I think AIPAC is like the most powerful Israeli lobby, obviously. But they include other groups and stuff, and that's all fine too. I mean, I don't really care too much if certain like Jewish groups supported the war or not, because it's the same kind of issue of did their support for that make a causal link to the decision. So they list all these Jewish organizations. I'll be honest, I haven't really heard of many of them, and I don't think they have like a significant influence on anything. If any real influence they have, it might just be on like Jewish people themselves, I guess. But that's also odd because, as they put it on page 243, that American Jews are significantly more opposed to the Iraq War than the general American public. They list a couple Jewish orgs like Tikkun and Jewish Voice for Peace that were anti-war, but they say that those groups pale in comparison to groups like AIPAC, which is true. And I do think AIPAC, as they suggested, generally supported the war once the war plan had been established and kind of announced. But overall, I would just say that I think it's, again, kind of something I see with a lot of JQ stuff. I'm not saying Walt and Mearsheimer are like JQers or anti-Jewish. They make it pretty clear that they don't consider that a thing. Like, it's not a Jewish war or anything like that. But like the hyper focus on only Jews in Israel, it kind of just goes like, I mean, I understand that there's a focus on it because that's like the point of the paper, is to talk about the Israel lobby, but I think it just misses out on the grand or wider context that a lot of people were supporting the war, a lot of different organizations and groups and individuals, many of whom weren't like Israel supporting like explicitly or Jewish or whatever. So it's just something I see in a lot of JQ discourse, is that it's just like a hyper specific focus on only like Jews or Israel or something, and then there's no like broader context. Not to say what they're saying is like not factual or totally wrong, it just doesn't have the wider context. They make the claim that Richard Clarke's book and Ron Susskind's book suggest that Bush and Cheney wanted to invade Iraq before they assumed office. They claim that this is inaccurate, but from what I can tell, there were at least definitely somewhat of a mentality in that direction that Saddam had to go. I think there is evidence given by Kramer and Duggan showing that Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld all had either private statements or just worldviews that suggested that they wanted to take Saddam out. Bush, on talking with Clinton during the intermediary transition from Clinton to Bush, Bush told Clinton that Saddam was on his top of the priority list. Cheney was instrumental in appointing the neocons who wanted Saddam out. So again, that's another instance of the dog wagging the tail, that Cheney knew these people wanted Saddam out, and that's why he appointed them. And his concerns with oil supply and stuff like that may have had something to do with that. That could be talked about later. And Rumsfeld wanted to show, like in the past during the Cold War, that the U.S. had military might and a show of force was necessary to more or less keep up appearances, keep up global U.S. hegemony. None of these are slam dunks, but I don't think there's really slam dunk evidence that they were super against the idea of taking Saddam out. I think it was, people had it on their mind, but it just depended on when that could be unleashed, and 9/11 seemed to be that turning point, although just not immediately. They do point to Cheney's public statements, but Cheney had, again, as I said, private statements that were contrary to that, and that he was just going along with Bush Sr., but really believed more in Bush Jr.'s line of thinking. They do bring up people like Kenneth Pollack, who wrote the book The Gathering Storm, Case for Invading Iraq. Definitely can't really deny that. There was only a couple books. I mean, obviously there's a bunch of articles and op-eds written about from various groups and people saying that Iraq should be invaded, but the only books I'm aware of are by Pollack, Lori Mallory. I'm not sure if she's Jewish or not, but she's definitely identified with neocons, so no real qualms there. He goes on to talk about intel gathering, but that's mainly to do with neocons, so I'm going to do that in the next video. They go on to talk about how oil, or again, they mentioned that it wasn't the motivating factor for the war, citing that if the U.S. had wanted the oil or whatever, they wouldn't have just invaded. Saddam wanted to get rid of it, or not get rid of it, sell it, and saying that if the U.S. wanted control of an oil-rich country, they could have just invaded Saudi Arabia. They were already there, etc. The problem with this is that the U.S., it's not necessarily a concern of U.S. direct control over oil. The U.S. at the time, I'm not sure if that's changed, but at the time did not get most of its oil from the Persian Gulf, actually, but that was the main supply for other countries like in the EU and China and stuff, and that steady supply of oil is pretty key to the whole world economy functioning. And the idea that Saddam wanted to sell the oil, yeah, that was obviously the case, but there were, UN sanctions on him that were initiated after the first Gulf War, in which he invaded a sovereign country. And the whole idea is that you don't want to just give a dictator a bunch of cash flow, because at that point then he will rebuild, and he clearly had aims to invade other countries and dominate the region. No one would deny that. Most of the Arab world at the time knew that, and that's why Kuwait and Saudi Arabia was really gung-ho about the first Gulf War, and even the second Gulf War, the Saudis helped, and obviously Kuwait was a launching ground for the U.S. Army. And there were just other general concerns about oil at the time, in terms that oil use was going to peak, or not peak, it was going to increase, and that there was not enough supply at the time, and that would have bad effects for the economy. You can read about that more in this Guardian article, where it mentions the 2001 report on energy security, and just that essentially Saddam was erratic and just was not good for a steady flow of oil in the world supply. And I mean, lifting UN sanctions, like, that wasn't necessarily just like in the cards. I don't know why they think that would be like such an easy thing to do. And one can just look at the corruption behind the whole like oil for food program thing to see how that was kind of messy. So it wasn't just like this clear cut thing like, oh yeah, like Saddam wanted to sell oil and make money. Like, I mean, yeah, but that's not really seeing the grand picture, I'd say. They later go on to talk about how the Iraq War was supposed to be this kind of quick thing that would have a domino effect in the region, sprouting up like Western-friendly democracies, and that this would be good for U.S. and Israeli long-term interests. I don't really see how this would be necessarily the Israeli goal, as they kind of put it. The Israelis at the time were pretty opposed to democracy in the Middle East, if anything. They were worried about democracy in Iraq, for example, because it would just become a Shia majority, or it was already a Shia majority, but it would lead to a Shia government, which would be a proxy of Iran. And Israel knows that the Arab Street, quote unquote, is very anti-Israel, whereas Arab dictators and leaders more or less could more on like a practical basis be worked with. So I would say this is more of a neocon thing rather than an Israeli thing, although there's definitely some crossover. And because this has more to do with neocons, in my opinion, I'm going to leave that for the second video, but the Kramer and Thrall anthology deals with that a little bit. Walt and Mearsheimer conclude saying that the Iraq War has not been good for Israel either, after saying it was not good for the US, obviously, or Iraq. I think this is kind of telling as well. I think there are certain worries that certain Israeli officials had regarding the war that they expressed, but once they saw that the US was going to go to war, they latched onto it. But the whole argument of the text, or at least the argument of this video, and like what a lot of people claim, is that the war was a like Jewish or Israeli neocon creation. But I don't think they really make the case that, I mean, they even flatly say it was not initiated by Israel or the lobby, but rather the neocons, which I'll get to later. But yeah, that would be the crux of the argument for me, is that, at least in terms of the lobby in Israel, I wouldn't say they had a huge role. I think you could see times when the US like differed with Israel on policy and they had their way, and then during the times when they agree, then they agree, and that's fine. But I just don't think people outside an administration can really do too much to influence within the administration. But that's when the neocons come in and actually, obviously influence the administration. So we're going to get into that in the next video. I'm going to lead off with just something from an article about this subject by Walter Russell Mead, who said that the Israeli defense establishment was deeply skeptical of neoconservative hopes for a democratic renaissance in the Middle East, showing a difference there, as well as a similar quotation from Ben Fishman's review of the book. And lastly, a quote from Flynn and Hillary Leverett, who said that basically there was no Israeli officials or leaders of the American Jewish community who influenced the decision to go to war, unlike the pro-Israel intellectuals and neocons in the administration. So I'm just gonna leave it off there. There's a difference between like neocons and like the lobby and stuff. So yeah, it's kind of a lot. It's a lot of information to wade through. So you can probably tell that I'm like a bit exasperated going through all this. So but anyway, there'll be a video 2 talking about the neocons. So see you then.